Hello and welcome along to Ardent Talks, our podcast that talks about our experience working on infrastructure and regeneration projects across the UK and Ireland. Today's episode is a special one as we're celebrating achieving a big milestone, possibly one that no other consultancy has actually reached just yet. We're celebrating advising on 100 development consent orders. We're working on DCO projects since the Planning Act's inception in 2008. We're very proud of the milestone that we've reached, working across all of the sectors involved, whether it's transport, renewables or utilities, commercial projects too. I'm pleased today that I'm joined by three colleagues at Ardent who will talk about their experience working on DCOs over the past 15 or 16 years. We have Vicky James, who's Managing Director of our Consent Management Consultancy, Tom Hacker, Head of Planning and Engagement, and Pete Gibbard, who's Head of Strategic Growth Renewables. I'm going to pass across to them before we get into the topic in more detail, just to provide a quick introduction and an overview of their experience and what they do at Ardent. So over to you first, Vicky.
Hi, John, and thanks for having me. I've worked in major civil infrastructure for over 20 years and at the Olympics in that time. And I've worked with major planning within major civils for over 16 of those. I head up a team of project managers that specialise in managing the consent process. And that's particularly with a focus on that gap between gaining the consent and being able to start in site. So the true whole life cycle of the consent.
Thanks, Vicky. And over to you, Pete. Can you provide an overview of what you do at Ardent in your experience?
Yeah, thanks, John. As John said, I head up the renewable energy growth side at Ardent. I've actually been at Ardent for nearly 20 years. And so in that time, I've been involved in a large number of Ardent's DCO projects, mainly from the land perspective in the early years, undertaking a lot of the land referencing and leading on a lot of the referencing deliverables, moving on to more of the landowner engagement and negotiations. And then in the latter years of technical work, driving the project forward, giving that land strategy advice to clients from a project director role. And then in the last couple of years, I've focused more around our renewable energy growth, particularly with the boom in offshore wind and more latterly the solar project boom as well. So I've certainly seen a lot of DCO projects go from day one to completion, and I've also been the land expert at 8 examinations as well. So I've had my fair share of examination bruises.
Thanks, Pete. And Tom, can you provide an introduction?
Thanks, John. Yep, very glad to be here. So I oversee our planning functions in Ardent across the UK and Ireland, and then also our engagement function, which is a term that we use to refer to all things stakeholder engagement, public consultation, communications, and elements of marketing and PR as well. My background initially in planning and major transport infrastructure and now very much in the renewables sector is going to bring a lot of lessons from that period to talk through today. So yeah, really looking forward to it.
Fantastic. Thanks to all three of you. We'll talk initially about the early days of DCOs. As I mentioned, the inception of DCOs came with the Planning Act back in 2008. I was here during my first stint at Ardent back then. I remember very well we were involved in the first DCO, the Rookery South Energy from Waste project back in 2008, 2009. Just coming to each of you, Vicky, you've been deeply involved in consent management since those days. How did the process of obtaining consents for infrastructure project change with the introduction of DCOs?
Yeah, it's an interesting journey. I think the introduction of the DCO framework was a really positive step in terms of streamlining the consent process by combining the various permits and approvals into a single application with obvious similarities to the Transport and Works Act regime, which I was probably more heavily in that time when it was introduced. But the difference being that the introduction of the Act established those clear timelines that was missing from the TWA in terms of decision making. And that was a huge step forward for helping project developers plan more effectively. The key part obviously being that the Secretary of State was required to make a decision on the DCO application, a set timeline of 18 months. That remained pretty true up until COVID. I think unfortunately we're now seeing a slip back with those timelines not offering as much certainty and risk pots having to be a lot bigger because of that delayed decision process. As we've discussed previously, having had 6 different Secretary of States even just in DESNES since 2019, hasn't really helped the situation.
Absolutely. Regime that was brought in to provide certainty more recently hasn't been providing that, and we'll get onto that in a little bit more detail later. Pete, in your role advising on land assembly and compulsory acquisition, what were some of the early challenges that promoters faced?
Yeah, thanks, John. Really around the stakeholder engagement. First off, it was a new process to a lot of those involved in it. It was a new process to the developers. They had to get ahead around the new expectations and the new requirements. But certainly in terms of that stakeholder engagement and engaging with landowners as well, there was a lot of front-loaded discussions with landowners around meeting and engaging with those potentially affected by the project. You had to take on board their comments, listen to their comments, take them away, review them. And a lot of that information that was gained from landowners, you had to show your story and your narrative about how you got from your early optioneering stage through to your final red line boundary. So it wasn't a case of doing it as a tick box exercise. You really had to take it on board and spend quite a lot of time interrogating and identifying those potential changes and whether they could work. I suppose another slight difficulty at the start of the new process was obviously getting a lot of the land agents on board and also some of the larger land holdings, the land estates parties as well. I think nowadays there aren't many rural land agents who haven't represented a client through a DCO process. They're well versed in it. They know the process. They know the stages. They know what they need to do. I think back then it was all very new and quite scary to that side of the fence as well as the developers. That certainly took quite a long time in the early stages. And I suppose coupled with that, there was also fewer precedents. So people were trying to find their way through the process and find out what was required and what needed to be produced. Nowadays, you can see all the documents and all the past applications that have gone forward. So even if you are a new developer to the process, you've got a fair understanding of the requirements. You've got a fair understanding of the examination questions that are likely to come out and the format. And there's a lot more chat around it. So yeah, from a land perspective, very much the same sort of points, really, just needing to cope with a new way of doing things, new requirements.
Thanks, Pete. Obviously, over 15 years, the process has evolved and have been some changes and some lessons learned. So if we talk through some of the key milestones during that period, Vicky, coming to you first of all, as somebody who's been advising on DCOs for over a decade, what are some of the major milestones that you've witnessed that shaped the process? And have there been any changes in regulation or policy that you'd point to that significantly impact how consents are obtained?
So I think the strengthening of the EIA requirements, particularly with the amendments following 2017 and 2021 updates, has placed a greater emphasis on sustainability and environmental considerations in the DCO process, something which runs current through a lot of themes nowadays, particularly with the upcoming generation. But as time moved on, I think this is a double-edged sword, in my opinion, with the intricacies of things like the habitat regulation assessment taking a disproportionate weight in the hearing process and the subsequent impact on judicial review. I think linking to previous points made, the need to overprove every point has created a mountain of additional paperwork in the submission, which in my mind neither helps the promoter, affected party or the stakeholders. While it was a positive step forward, I think it's brought with it some problems.
Thanks, Vicky. To you, Tom, with engaging with communities and other stakeholders being a critical part of the DCO process, how has the landscape of stakeholder engagement changed? I think you've touched on this briefly, but in terms of the use of technology, community expectations, and the scope of consultations as well, how have you seen that evolution?
Irrecognisable in many ways, to be honest. You know, that there are many core principles that are the same. So the gunning principles, which helpfully inform a lot of how consultation and engagement is undertaken, remain as relevant today in 2024 as they were nearly 30 years ago when they were set in stone. But the way in which we actually go about that engagement is completely different since 2008. And I think that the scale of the change is across 3 different areas. And you'll all recognise these because we ourselves as stakeholders, we're practitioners, we're involved in development of projects, but we're all customers. We are all stakeholders and we all use or have interaction with these things. But, social media is a massive game changer. This is something that not just the UK, not even just the Western world, but the entire planet is in some way hooked to use of social media. And the main thing is how what we see on social media influences how we feel. So if you look back at 2008, no promoter of a project would have been saying, I need to develop I've heard of this recent Facebook. Can we look at getting a Facebook account? if they'd have even known it existed because it was in such early days, never mind Twitter and obviously platforms that were 10 years off even existing. So the way that we interact with stakeholders and the way that stakeholders interact with each other through social media has completely transformed the communication of these types of projects. Then second and linked to that, I think, is wider digitalization. So now we would use online engagement platforms with maps and the opportunity to see materials and consume video and potentially listen to a podcast on a particular subject. And that so many people obviously have smartphones and that they're using this technology to engage with other people beyond and outside of social media is incredible. And again, a massive challenge, but a massive opportunity for promoters of projects. And personally, I would rather be sat here now in 2024 with all of these tools at my disposal than working in 2008 without those tools. And then the third thing is that the climate emergency, there've been there's been big changes in society since 2008, but the really big one is the way that we now view the climate emergency as being, people to different degrees, potentially, how serious they see it, but a massive challenge for a country like the United Kingdom. And the way that we communicate projects and the sense of feeling that the public has one way or another, often very concerned and anxious about climate emergency, but also very concerned about how we go about solving it. And us as practitioners of consultation and engagement, particularly in relation to renewables projects and utilities projects, but if you think regeneration projects and transport projects, they have to be solving this problem as well. They need to be, and we need to be, communicating how our projects help meet these wider objectives of our country and our planet. And where we do that effectively, we'll meaningfully engage people. Where we don't do that effectively, then each individual project will just be seen on its own individual impacts and benefits rather than a wider story that we're trying to tell. So I think social media, digitalization and climate change, it's just so different and the skills that we need in order to be practitioners has changed as a result.
Thanks, Tom. I agree with so much of that. I was just Googling while you were talking there about when the first podcast was recorded. It was apparently 2003, but Apple Podcast launched in 2012 and Spotify was 2011. So they certainly went around. Nobody was podcasting on DCOs back in 2008, 2009. And I suppose linked to what you've just been talking about, particularly in relation to renewable energy projects, one of the things that we see in renewable projects is the battle against fake news. I'll use that term given it's the American elections this week. But the amount of propaganda that's out there that talks about the negative impacts of whether it's solar projects, whether it's offshore wind projects, etc. I'm going to come to you, Pete, and just ask you about the boom we've seen in renewables projects in recent years. And how's the growth of renewables, the renewable sector influence the DCO regime? What are some of the most significant differences you've observed in DCO applications for renewable projects compared to, if you like, more traditional infrastructure?
Thanks, John. Yeah, so I wouldn't say that the renewable sector has necessarily influenced the regime, but there's certainly some differences around the renewable sector and also the energy sector. I think one of those key differences around the projects and the land requirements in particular. With road and rail projects, the majority of land is acquisition, and obviously you've got the need for temporary land for construction, but the main rights you're seeking with landowners acquisition, whereas for offshore wind and also for solar, you've got a large proportion of the relative number of landowners you're engaging with are around a cable easement. So for the most part, they will be remaining in occupation of the land, they're remaining to farm the land, but the rights you're seeking are a permanent cable right. So that adds a different dimension in terms of your negotiations and engagement with landowners, and particularly bringing those who aren't necessarily going to benefit as financially from the proposals as those perhaps who are hosting the main infrastructure, the solar panels, etc. So that is a challenge from the land perspective, is getting those landowners to engage and getting them to come to the table around negotiations as well. Let's not forget that the requirement to try and secure the land and rights needed for a project by agreement still exists, but it's been increasingly emphasised throughout the life cycle of the DCO, I think. I remember back in the early days of DCO, there was an expectation that you tried to reach agreement and you'd issued heads of terms during the examination, and we're continuing to try and secure those rights. But looking back through the years, that's become increasingly front-loaded, and now there's the expectation on developers that heads of terms will have not only just been issued prior to application, but actually a good number of landowners will actually have signed up as well. And that means you've got to fix your red line boundary a lot earlier. to allow you that certainty of the land need that you have from that particular landowner and enter into those negotiations. The stakeholder engagement as well, obviously the need to pick up with landowners affected and go through that optioneering process. Again, on cable routes, there's a lot more flexibility around that than there is around a rail or a road scheme, for example. So I think it's a lot harder to just dismiss landowner comments and landowner suggestions around routing, and that can cause its delays at the early stages and around that formal consultation on the process. And I guess the final point in the renewable energy sector in particular, you've got that balance of offshore and onshore needs as well. So you've got the sensitive marine environments, which brings into play a more complex environmental statement than just terrestrial matters. I think that also adds a different dimension when you're talking about renewable energy schemes, particularly those offshore, to your traditional road and rail projects.
As I mentioned at the outset, we're celebrating having advised on 100 DCOs now. So milestone we're very proud to have reached. I think having got to that point, it's only fair that we share some lessons that we've learned along the way. As a general question to you all, now that the process has matured, I'm wondering whether there are any best practices that have emerged from delivering the projects that we've been involved with successfully. So I'll come to you first, Vicky. And how has the role of a consent management team evolved, or what advice would you give to someone new to this field now?
It's strange. I find it's still a relatively new area of specialism. I'm not going to say I'm the only person doing it, but there have been various examples of project management in the consented space, but they've tended to come from specialist areas like planning or environment or even engineering, which I think always gives a slightly wonky view when you get to the finish line. I would, of course, always advocate for independent project management that spans the whole life cycle, mainly so that you can apply for a job that can be built rather than just creating a permission that then gains the consent. I suppose for me, anyone staring down the barrel of a DCO, project organisation and a clear picture of what the true programme and subsequent boundaries and constraints, it is critical to creating the healthy contract environment when you're handing it over to delivery. So I think I've seen some good practice where this has been about, but I think it very much has differed in the nature of the project that's getting applied for. Some of the major projects get applied for just to be able to get the consent. And for me, good practice is when you have a proportionate representation of the delivery team for the consent process. So you're getting a consent to build rather than a consent for a consent to then hand over to build. I would say is always that advice to try and look at the whole life cycle and think about what does that mean when you hand that over. I think if I've got any quest, it's to rid the world of having contractor must comply with the DCO in any contract, because it's a pretty meaningless. It's a catch-all that means naffle.
Thanks, Vicky. I'm going to summarise that by saying that you would advise any promoter to get the art and consent management consultancy team involved from the outset and to work with them all the way through the process. I would also agree with you.
What a great idea. If you've summarised that from that, John, what can I say? But yes, absolutely.
I read between the lines. Pete, I'm going to come to you next from a strategic growth perspective and the development of the process. What's the next frontier for the DCO regime? Do you foresee any major shifts in policy or project types, perhaps over the coming years?
Thanks, John. I'm not going to talk about or spend any length of time on the proposed changes to the limits. I think that you could have a whole podcast on that just on its own. But around the onshore wind limit from 50 megawatts to 100 megawatts, and for solar for 50 to 150, and the pros and cons on that. And I'm sure many people have responded to the consultation around that point. In terms of the project types coming forward over the next couple of years, I think the solar, I keep using the phrase, but it is a bit of a solar boom at the moment, will continue. I think that the solar projects will continue to come forward. Ardent have been involved in around 25 solar DCOs to date, and we're getting almost weekly approaches at the moment to be involved in more. So I hope, and I don't see that reducing anytime soon. Offshore wind, I think, will continue to play a major part in the renewable energy contribution. Battery energy storage systems, obviously, are not part of the DCO regime at the moment. They typically fall under the remit of local planning authorities through the TCPA, Town and Country Planning Act process for approval. There has been ongoing debate and increasing calls to bring larger scale based developments under the DCO, given their sort of growing importance in the UK's energy transition. There's obviously the co-location that brings them in at the moment. But I think we may see changes in policy that bring those large-scale based projects into the DCO regime in the future. especially given that energy storage becomes increasingly critical for both grid stability and achieving the net zero goals. The second, I think, is hydrogen. There's an increasing talk around hydrogen. That the British Energy Security Strategy, BEIS, not to be confused with the battery BEIS, but doubled our 5 gigawatt low carbon hydrogen production capacity ambition up to 10 gigawatts by 2030, with half of this coming from electrolytic hydrogen. Obviously, hydrogen projects are not automatically within the development consent order regime under the Planning Act, but they can fall under the process depending on the scale and the type of the project. You can obviously apply for Section 35 consent as well, which, for example, H2T side did the same, was considered a project of national significance. Hydrogen production facilities are generally not included under DCO regime either, and they would also typically be consented through the Town and Country Planning Act process. So I think both them and hydrogen and BEIS are likely to feature more highly going forward into the future.
Thanks, Pete. And Tom, coming to you next. You've already talked about how technology has changed the game and how communities' expectations have changed in terms of stakeholder engagement. But if you were to provide one piece of advice to promoters when it comes to effectively engage with stakeholders during the DCO process, what would that be?
I'm going to be cheeky, John. I'm going to offer 4. I like to do things in 3s and 5s normally, but I think first thing is you got to get our team in. I think that's the quickest route to success. And obviously lots of our clients realize that. But I think taking on board the question, I think that there are 3 things, and I'll rattle them off quickly. I think the first thing is about big data. So every year that we are on this planet, we have access to 10 times, 100 times more data. And that data now can help inform our strategies such that we're not just copying a plan for engagement from one project to the next. That might have been done 10 years ago, 15 years ago, but every single plan and strategy should be bespoke to the community, and the data is readily available to inform us to do that. Big data and strategies informed by big data is the first one. Second one is about old is good, old is great. All the old ways of doing things are still as relevant as what they were. We need to post letters through people's doorsteps. We need to be through letterboxes, We need to be hosting events in local village halls. This is important now as it ever was, but the attention to detail needs to absolutely be there. Every event needs to be fully accessible. The layout of an event needs to be carefully considered. The resourcing for these events needs to be carefully considered. That's because these projects, major infrastructure projects, have significant and real impacts on people's lives. And we need to deliver a consultation and engagement plan which reflects the seriousness of that. And then the third point I want to make is that we do all those traditional things and we do them really well, but we need to innovate. If we continue to do things purely the way we've always done them, we will get similar or the same results as we've always had, which is relatively low levels of engagement with the wider audience, and also often not as constructive feedback as what we'd like. So we need to introduce innovation across social media, across the wider digital landscape, across artificial intelligence, which is something I'm really passionate about, because we want to be having a broader, more inclusive conversation with a wider audience, and more people are open to these new ways of communication. So I think get us in, that's your big one, to be honest. That's the key. If you get that, run to a winner. But then big data, old is good, but get the detail right, and then keep innovating now and into the future.
Tom, can I ask you a question on that? I'm really curious about how the planning process seems to really almost champion those objectors, which in some respects is right, because it's great that this country has a system where people have a right to say something. But what's your approach now on getting those silent supporters on board? I think that's a real area of innovation, just considering about what you've just talked about.
Yeah, on a big project where we're given free rein and a lot of opportunity to do things that need to be done in order to progress a project, obviously we'll be looking at broader social media. But I don't mean just using social media, posting something on there that you've also got in a flyer or a leaflet. It's about creating interesting content that engages with people, that's going to capture the imagination and encourage them to take part in the project. But also the wider opportunity to undertake polling. And again, these are things which were really difficult and complex in 2008, but now much easier, much cheaper. And it means we can layer into a consultation report the responses that we've had from what some refer to as, it's not a term I use, but self-selecting individuals who have chosen to take part in your consultation, to layer that information in alongside information you've gathered from other means, including polling, potentially including the things that you're hearing on social media, obviously the things that you're having from stakeholder meetings that you've gone to and that you continue to go to, so that when you reach the point where you're writing that consultation report, you're trying to communicate and summarize as wider thoughts and feelings as possible, and avoid a situation where you are purely playing back or reprinting the views of a relatively small segment. The only final thing I'll say on that, Vicky, is just that we can, as practitioners, have a bit of group thinking here around the whole NIMBYism concept, but we do need to remember that the communities that are closest to some of this infrastructure are the ones that have to live with it. In a solar farm, that might be 40, 60 years. In other instances, it's longer. And therefore, we do need to take them very seriously. We do need to have an intimate relationship with them where we're listening to their thoughts and feelings, and we're trying to take those on board as best we can. And I do use that term from time to time, and I do share some of the feelings that you've just shared, Vicky, but I've also met a lot of people who are really significantly impacted by projects that might benefit everyone else, but not necessarily them. And we need to be mindful of that.
Interesting. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Vicky. So looking to the future of the DCO process, we've touched on it somewhat. I'm not sure whether, Pete, there's anything you want to add in terms of where you see the biggest opportunities for growth in DCO applications. You talked particularly about renewables already. Is there anything else you want to add there?
Thanks, John. I think offshore wind, as I said, will continue, particularly with floating wind farms. The floating wind farm technology opens up obviously greater geographic areas for offshore wind. Solar and battery co-location, there's an increasing potential for locating solar and battery projects together, which combines obviously the renewable generation with on-site storage, which provides that more consistent energy output. Hydrogen I've talked about. And I guess the other project type that I haven't mentioned too much is energy from waste. Ardent has certainly done a couple of energy from waste DCO projects. And I think with increasing concerns around waste management and energy efficiency, I think energy from waste projects present another growth area for renewable DCO applications. And I think they are also essential for waste to energy conversion and playing their part in the UK's decarbonisation strategy. That's about all I have to say really on the future of renewable DCOs. I think they will continue, and I think they will continue to increase as we look towards those renewable technologies to provide our energy.
Thanks, Pete. Yeah, it's worth just mentioning that in our response as a business, our response to the NPPF and the question around the thresholds that perhaps should be applied to onshore wind and solar, we took the view, didn't we, that actually the most sensible option that government could take forward would be to provide developers with flexibility, so allow developers to decide for themselves what is the appropriate consenting regime for their projects. And there'll be lots of site-specific reasons why the TCPA regime or the DCO regime may be more suitable for different projects. I don't know whether there's anything else you want to say on that point, Pete, but I thought it's just worth mentioning it.
Yeah, I suppose one of the obvious benefits is your accessibility to compulsory powers, and whether developers need that opportunity to apply for those powers will probably come down to the length of cable route and how far away they are from the grid connection point. If you've got a large project but you're connecting in right next door or on that landowner's land holding, you won't need those powers. There are obviously other benefits, but from a purely land perspective, that would be the main benefit of going through a DCO, as it gives you those compulsory acquisition powers to wrap up land interest along a lengthy cable route and cleanse any other third-party interests along the route.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to have a bet with anybody that if the threshold moves to 150 megawatts for solar, we'll see a huge number of 149.9 megawatt applications going through TCPA. So hopefully they won't come up with such an arbitrary threshold, but we'll see.
Just on that point, John, I suppose they'll then come up against the other delaying factor in the processes, which is the availability of planning resources and local authorities to deal with this number of applications. But again, you could have an entirely new podcast on that point alone as well. But that is also, let's not forget, one of the main barriers and reasons for speed of bringing these projects forward.
Yeah, we could do a podcast on it. Is 300 new planning officers enough? And I think we all know the answer to that. Okay, I think we've done land well there, Pete. Looking at consenting more generally, Vicky, are there any particular reforms or changes that you expect to see, whether that's through the NP consultation or otherwise?
Well, I think it's positive that the approach from the government is to speed up planning. It's definitely the right narrative, but I worry that they're looking in the wrong places. the planning process as it stands is currently no Lego piece to a contracting mechanism like NEC, for example. The planning process sits quite separately. We must see it major infrastructure and planning in terms of a whole life cycle. And for me, we've got to recognise that gap between the end of the examination and the start on site as an actual stage. It's currently a no man's land. So I would really hope that the government doesn't just focus on planning. And I also think it's a bit lazy to say that the planning process is broken. I think if we started at the top of the conversation talking about when it was first brought on board, if we went back to its original premise, I don't think we'd be going too far wrong. I think we've just got to look a little bit longer about how do we get these things into build. I suppose the obvious place to pick, though, would be the judicial review process. And I know there's some steps around that to look about how many times you can bite that same cherry. So I would hope to see some reforms in that area. And again, picking up on things that Pete said about landowners and Tom said about affected stakeholders, that's not to take away the right of the landowner, and we must take those properly into consideration. But I think there does come a point that the fact that it's a nationally significant infrastructure project that we're talking about, there has to be a point where you're focusing on a decision period, particularly, which a lot of the general public don't realise, the amount of funding that's hanging around for a decision, the costs of holding the A-grade team to deliver some of the most particular jobs. Again, we've got to just be looking at life beyond the end of an examination. That's if I had my magic wand to wave.
Completely agree with that. I think it was a positive step forward that Charlie Banner's recommendations were published last week to look at how we can reduce delays to MSIPs, and particularly removing things like the second bite of the cherry opportunity that just causes uncertainty for everybody and allow people to cause mischief, frankly. Yeah, I think that would be a good step if government takes on some of those recommendations. Tom, coming to you next on this one. So you've talked a lot about how things have changed, but what further change do you foresee in the world of stakeholder engagement? What things should DCO promoters be preparing for?
Yeah, there's a few things. And I think it's not just preparing for, as in what change is going to be imposed on us. We're talking a lot to promoters about them developing a plan and a strategy that really aligns with their own values and forward thinking in many instances, but also try and see around the bend of what future trends. And some of that is around encouraging developers and promoters to be positive and proactive. When it comes to stakeholders, there's no mileage in distance. You need to stay close with your key stakeholders and you need to engage them early in the process. And I can only see future guidance further encouraging developers to engage early and often and develop a close working relationship and be bold and positive about what they're promoting, whilst also being sensitive, of course. And then we look back, 2010 Equality Act is a big influence on the way that consultation in engagement is delivered, but that might well be updated in the next decade, and we might see further encouragement or regulation around how inclusive consultation exercises need to be, and we should be thinking about that now, and we are on many of our projects doing that now. But also around data and AI, there's a huge transition going on in terms of the way that we access data, the way we process data, and the way that people interact with retailers or promoters of projects, whatever else it is. So trying to think about how we embrace some of those. If we can analyze the results of a consultation in 24 hours, John, compared to 6 months, what does that mean? How do we embrace that? But how do we actually make it beneficial for our project? How do we get the design changes in quicker? How do we improve the project with as wider inputs as possible? Across those 3 things, I think that there's a massive opportunity for promoters in the next 5 years. And we've got a lot to do in this country, but we should feel really positive about our ability to do it.
Yeah, I agree, Tom. It's good to be positive about what we can achieve. We've achieved a lot. There's a lot more to come. I'll come to each of you for any closing comments before I just summarise a few key takeaways. Pete, I'll come to you first. I don't know if there's anything that you would want to just add closing out.
Nothing that I haven't really covered already, other than to say it's certainly been interesting watching the DCO process evolve over the last 15 years, particularly as those who are often come up against on the other side in terms of the land agents and the NFU certainly become more well-versed in the process and also how to potentially derail projects if they are opposed to them. And the easiest ways to do that. So there's been both positives and having them understand it and getting things moving quickly, but also negatives in terms of the ability they have to try and stop things. I think introductions like the CA schedule that is now commonplace on all DCO applications. I don't know when it first came in, but it certainly wasn't around right at the very beginning of the process. But that's certainly that something that there's had an increasing light shed on it over the last few years. It's expected to be updated now at nearly every deadline through the examination. And it really does focus developers and their appointed land consultants' minds on reaching private agreements where at all possible. And they expect to see a continuing improvement on that through each deadline. That's certainly, I would say, one of the main changes I've seen over the 15 years is that real focus in on completing agreements. But going back to my point I made a minute ago, the land agents on the other side are aware of that, and it can sometimes cause prices paid to be pushed up because they know they've got you and they know that you're trying to complete those agreements to de-risk your consent. So it's just something to be wary of for any other developers that are listening to this. But yeah, that's probably all I have to say on it. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Pete. Vicky, come to you next. Any closing remarks?
I think it's exciting. The future of the DCO is exciting to the point of being terrifying. Rachel Reeves's budget last week was a whopper, but lots of positive support on a range of projects. If you couple that with what we've already talked about in terms of the government's drive to speed up these projects and the need for energy independence, I suppose I'd conclude in saying that good project management is going to be vital. So I think that's another plug as well.
I think it is. Thank you, Vicky. And Tom, anything finally from you? Any final thoughts?
Yeah, a couple to throw in there. One was it's good to reflect and lots of good things that we've covered here, but action's the key thing. We can spend all day thinking about how different things are now compared to what they were, but we need to make sure that we're spending an equal amount of time focusing on what needs to change and be done differently. And then I sound like a broken record on this, John, but we can get very excited about all of the infrastructure that is required, absolutely required, and that we're on with delivering. But we do need to remember that these projects have, in many instances, very real and meaningful and challenging impacts on individuals and communities. So whenever I see an announcement about trying to fast track projects and trying to deliver spades in the ground, I appreciate that and I do to hear it, but we shouldn't compromise on consultation and engagement, and no guidance is going to come out saying that, because it's really important that we get this right and we do it right. And just to point out, John, what you said earlier about whether consultation and engagement has loaded more costs onto projects. I see where you're coming from, but I think there's an alternative way of looking at that, where the biggest cost is the failed projects. Money literally wasted on a scheme that goes nowhere, and we've all worked on them, and everyone listening will have done as well. And in many or most of those instances, it's because the scheme failed to capture the imagination of stakeholders, failed to engage them properly, or it just took too long for the promoter to realise that this wasn't the right project in the right location at the right time. And so I think actually consultation and engagement is in many instances a really good return on investment for promoters and will avoid huge costs and losses. So yeah, really welcome the opportunity to chat through all these and lots of interesting conversations there.
Comment on that, Tom, because obviously I've come here with my always pushing with the delivery hat, but I fundamentally agree with your point. I think if it's taken seriously from an earlier point, and again, getting the engagement of the delivery people with that proper understanding what the impact is to the local area and local residents, I think you can build that into construction methodology. So it's not just a consultation process to tick off as part of a planning regime. I think it does create a fundamental understanding and partnership with where you're building the job and the impacts.
Yep, absolutely. We talked about it already, isn't it? It's the fact it's not a box to tick, it's a tool. Great design work is a tool, great environmental work is a tool, great project management is a tool, and great engagement is a tool that will drive your project forward in the right direction, hopefully.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you to all three of you for joining me, to Vicky, Pete and Tom.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone.
We've talked about how the DCO regime has evolved over the past 15 years, and it's made me reflect on how Ardent's evolved in that time as well. So about 15 years, all we did as a business were land services. So we provided all the full suite of land services then that we still do now. But of course, we've added consent management consultancy, we've added stakeholder engagement, to our suite of services as well. I'm talking about consent management. I think more and more, whether it's looking at really big, complex infrastructure projects where there are massive risks when you move from consenting to delivery, there's a really clear need for our consent management consultancy service there, minding the gap between consenting and delivery, but also with the increase in renewable energy projects and particularly solar projects, which not always, but quite often are flipped from getting the consent and before they go into delivery. There's a massive need, not just for contractors to understand what's in the DCO and the obligations and commitments and conditions they're taking on, but also for investors and purchasers of projects to understand all of that as well. So there's a need that perhaps didn't exist really going back 15 years, and I think it is increasing as a need, particularly in the renewable space as well. And in terms of the stakeholder engagement service that it was established, it was always an obvious one to me, and it's always a puzzle to me really, that you'd have one organisation doing stakeholder engagement, community engagement, and another provider that was offering landowner engagement. And as a promoter of a project, you basically had two separate suppliers undertaking engagement services, feeding into one single consultation report, which is obviously required with any DCO. So by offering landowner engagement and stakeholder engagement together through a single supplier, as we do now, we allow our clients to de-risk that process. We take sole responsibility for producing the consultation report, and through using the new technologies that Tom's talked about and innovative ways of reaching out to all sorts of audiences, I feel that we've clearly stepped up and recognised the need to evolve our services during the 15-year period. So I'm proud of the things that we've achieved, and I think as a business we should be massively proud of reaching a milestone of 100 DCOs. Looking to the future, for me, I think the really key important thing for all DCO promoters is a need for certainty. That was one of the key reasons why the process was introduced in the first place, on the back of projects like Heathrow taking years and years, almost decades to achieve consent. For a long time, we had that certainty of a programme timeframe, particularly post-COVID, but we need to get that back. I think is absolutely essential for promoters, for funders, for investors to know when consent is going to be granted, and also hopefully know that once it is granted, that's it, they can progress and there's no second bite of the cherry for objectors. And hopefully the recommendations from last week will be taken on board, as I mentioned earlier. So there's a lot that we've covered there. It's been a really interesting, really exciting 15, 16 years. It's been a really good conversation. I really hope our audience has enjoyed listening. Thanks very much.